All right, welcome everybody back to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture. This is part of a theme that we've seen bubbling up. It won't necessarily be every week this theme being hit at, but you'll notice that we've been triangulating at it from a variety of angles as far as um well, the way I think I'll put this is that we've we're here because we've come to realize that there are false lines of reasoning, sometimes known as sophistry, throughout history, that are designed with the intention of making the false appear true and the true appear false, the good appear bad and the bad appear good, so that people desire ultimately those things that will lead to their own enslavement and undoing. And inversely, what's often forgotten, I think a lot of people they get a little bit when they pick up on the factual existence of the reality of conspiracies and intentions and ideas shaping our history, they can sometimes get a little bit black-pilled now and again and focus upon mastering the arts of lies and forget that these lies, this entire artistry of creating sophistry, of creating false arguments, making um again the false appear true, is a reaction to, it is not causal to anything. It's a reaction to the fact that human beings, when we are in a natural state, are brilliant, are good. We abide by conscience. Our powers of reasoning are in tune with the harmonies of the universe, and we make discoveries that make us more ennobled, make us appreciate our freedom, our dignity, and our responsibilities to the past and to the future much more readily. And that it manifests itself in such beautiful leaps and bursts of progress in different civilizations that look, it has obviously different appearances when you have a Renaissance dynamic explode onto the scene, overthrowing systems of feudalism, in whether it's in India, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's in Europe. There's different forms, different languages, but there's certain common principles based on our common humanity that are being tapped into. And I think that that's just a beautiful thing. And so I've been very impressed over the last few months, just getting to read the works of Hans Schantz, um, who has a very interesting an interesting, I don't know if I'd call it an organization. You can maybe correct me. As far as the official name here, Hans, that is that you're it's the Society for Post Quantum Research, right? Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
that's right.
Yeah. And Hans is a scientist. He's an inventor. He's somebody who's looked with a critical eye upon what's prevented us from making the types of breakthroughs and discoveries we really should have made if we were in a healthier state, unhinged for or unencumbered by this problem of oligarchism that's worked very hard at breaking our kneecaps every time the race is about to start. And so his work is very good and fields and energy. And I'm going to have a link to a lot of your Substack, your research that will complement today's presentation in the description box under this video. Most recently, I my eyes fell on a little piece that he did on Francis Bacon. And since we had a presentation 2 weeks ago by Jerry, a brilliant presentation on the counterintelligence espionage networks, the that were working to infiltrate England and transform it alchemically into an empire or a seat of expansionist evil. And we saw the role of Francis Bacon in that context, especially within the framework of the cultural fight that involved people like Christopher Marlowe playing a very big role, bigger than a lot of people realize. I thought this would be a very, very lawful and fun follow up to that presentation. We might do something in the coming weeks ahead if we can work this in on John Dee and some of the black magicians even before Francis Bacon. I'm hoping I can make this happen. But until then, he agreed to do a little presentation showcasing some of his discoveries and how it impacts today's world and the scientific dictatorships managing the thing called science today. So without further ado, let me introduce Hans to everybody. Hans, meet everybody. It's all yours.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you inviting me to give this lecture before your group here, Matt. I've followed your work for quite a while. It's been very informative and inspirational, and you've set me off on a whole bunch of interesting leads. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to return the favor. The program I'm working on at Fields and Energy is how electromagnetism and quantum mechanics work and where physics went wrong. And on the where physics went wrong department, one of the key nexi or nexuses that I've identified is Francis Bacon and the scientism that he inspired. So what I'm going to talk about in the my lecture here today is I'm going to start with I have to set a little bit of the context. The conventional narrative of Bacon is that he invented the scientific method ex nihilo. He came up with all of the methods of induction and investigation and experimentation that we take for granted today. So I need to set the context a little bit and talk about some of the work that predates Francis Bacon in the medieval era. I'll have to set a little more of the context. You got some of that from last week's lecture about the politics of Elizabethan England. And finally, we'll be able to talk about Francis Bacon, about just what a fascinating character he was, his early life, views on science, some of the criticisms and legacies that have been the criticisms leveled against him and the legacy that he has today. And it's fascinating to see centuries later the lasting influence he has had on modern culture, from Newton through the positivists all the way up to even Peter Thiel, quoting him as an expert or an authority. And I'll talk a little bit about what we mean when we say scientism. So to begin with, there is a lot of times people will talk about this supposed gap in progress, that nothing at all happened in the Dark Ages until the Renaissance picked up the ashes and rubble from Rome and rebuilt our civilization. You see in the context of philosophy of science, people like William Whewell, a noted historian of science. He wrote the History of the Inductive Sciences. He said it was unnecessary to go into detail regarding the history of the schoolmen and their philosophy in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century, because during the intermediate time, it was the same at the first and at the last. You have a historian of science, Ivor Hart, saying the history of science is sorry reading for the Middle Ages, that it was a period of ignorance, misunderstanding, and neglect. You can take a look at what Ernst Mach, who plays a figure in the popularization, or plays a role in the popularization of positivism, arguing that not much happened in science between Archimedes and Leonardo. Now, if you take a look, though, at the progress through what are sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, the reality is that growth built upon growth. There was an exponential increase of the output of manuscripts and of knowledge and the exchange of ideas pretty consistently from the 8th or 9th century on. I mean, you kind of have to keep in mind that oh yeah, we'll be happy to share the PowerPoint. I'll make that available to Matt to pass on and post with the slides, so you don't have to worry about taking notes if I pop through slides too quickly here. What I wanted to point out is a lot of this was kicked off with what's called the Carolinian Renaissance during the reign of Charlemagne. And it's fascinating to realize some of the things that we take for granted that had to be invented by someone in order for us to use them, like something as simple as using multiple cases in writing. Until the Carolinian Renaissance, all writing was in uppercase. And their great innovation was realizing words are a lot easier to read if you have lowercase and you're using uppercase words to denote the beginnings of sentences or proper names. But that built upon itself, and one of the key periods, and the one I'm going to highlight, is the 13th century, right in the knee of that curve there, because we had incredible figures like Albert of Cologne, who taught both Thomas Aquinas and Roger Bacon, and another figure, an English Franciscan named Robert Grosseteste, who I think far more than Francis Bacon is deserving of the title of Father of Science. And you notice that momentum carried all the way through the 14th century, even through the Black Death. That was really just losing a third of Europe's population was really not much more than a road bump in the growth the intellectual growth that was taking place despite all of the tragedy and the trauma that people were going through. Well, let me start by talking about Albert of Cologne. He was a very famous teacher. Sometimes he's referred to as Albert the Great. It was a time when experimental science was being rediscovered, and a lot of the ancient Greek and Byzantine sources were being funneled through Moorish Spain into Western Europe. You also have to understand a little bit about the religious politics taking place behind the scenes. The Dominican order, or the Black Friars, were among the original pioneers in scholarship. They were called Black Friars because of the characteristic black cassocks that they wore. You can see Albert of Cologne wearing one as he's lecturing the streets of Paris. His lectures were so popular, he had to hold them outside because there weren't any buildings large enough to hold the crowds that would gather to hear him talk about all kinds of subjects, from metals to anatomy, geography, chemistry, and more. But his greatest impact on history was probably through the students he taught. And his most famous student, arguably, is this one here, Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was recognized as a doctor of the church. He was, of course, the author of the Summa Theologica and a commentator on both scripture and on Aristotle. He believed that the study of nature reveals God, that nature is, in effect, another gospel displaying God's creation, that we can understand God through understanding God's creation. But he also relied on some rigid syllogistic methods, the basic syllogism of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion that follows from them. And a more innovative and powerful method he came up with that he called the quaestio method, where he would present objections to a particular thesis and then explain on the contrary, offer a counter statement, provide his thesis, followed by I answer that, and then replies, or preceded by I answer that, and then replies as needed. A very formulistic method, but a very powerful method for laying out arguments and keeping things organized and streamlined. And of course, Aristotle's works became central to education through Aquinas's and efforts, and through the efforts of Albertus Magnus. Now, just to review, a syllogism is an argument where you have a major premise, for instance, that a great philosopher is one whose methods and ideas profoundly shape philosophical inquiry across centuries. A minor premise, like Aquinas's methods and ideas have profoundly shaped philosophy for over 700 years. And then the conclusion, therefore, Aquinas was a great philosopher. Of course, the syllogism goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. But what Aquinas did was popularize and revive it, as well as introduce his own method, the method of the quaestio method of inquiry. So we could ask the question, was Thomas Aquinas a great philosopher? You could offer objections that he merely repeated Aristotle and church dogma without innovation, or that he relied on faith and that undermined his independence. And then, following this method, you would offer an argument to the contrary, that Augustine and modern philosophers hold that a philosopher integrates reason with ultimate questions of being and truth. And then the thesis, I answer that a great philosopher seeks truth through reason and contributes enduring ideas. Aquinas synthesized Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, created a method still studied today, and addressed questions of metaphysics, ethics, and law with lasting influence. Thus, by both scope and depth, Aquinas qualifies as a great philosopher. And then you could kind of pick up on any objections that were left hanging, argue Aquinas did not merely repeat Aristotle, he transformed his framework to answer theological and metaphysical problems. And far from undermining reason, Aquinas used it to strengthen theological claims, and by doing so extended philosophy's reach. This is a little laborious, but I wanted to give a flavor of the schoolmen methods that were pioneered by Aquinas. Now, one of the problems is that after Aquinas developed these methods, it became intellectually rigid and static. In 1286, the Dominicans issued a decree that required mandatory a defense of Aquinas's doctrine, and of course that discouraged innovation. You weren't allowed to disagree with what Aquinas had to say. And by reducing inquiry to these kinds of formulaic disputations, the later scholastics took Aquinas's dynamic methods and really led them into stagnation. It got to the point where in 1536, Pierre de la Rome, sometimes he's called Petrus Ramus, argued that Aristotle was entirely wrong in a thesis that he presented at the University of Paris in 1536. Now, he managed to carry that thesis over a fair amount of faculty opposition and got his degree, ultimately became a Protestant and was killed in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. But reforming this required returning to Aristotle's roots and not rejecting him outright. The conventional narrative is, Aristotle's methods are entirely bad, and they had to be supplanted by the work of Renaissance and Enlightenment scholars. But that revolution had already begun at the hands of people like Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon. Now we have to back up a moment and look at a little bit about the methods of science. And I think it's illustrative to take a look at Raphael's famous painting of the School of Athens to kind of get a handle on the difference between Plato and Aristotle. Raphael depicts Plato pointing upwards to the heavens, holding the Timaeus, symbolizing Plato's emphasis on ideal forms and transcendent reality. Aristotle, on the other hand, is shown gesturing horizontally and holding his ethics, representing his focus on empirical observation and the physical world. And there's really an intellectual cycle here at play, where Plato tended to emphasize taking axioms, fundamental concepts, paradigms, theories, and deductively working out their consequences in the real world. Aristotle's approach was inductive. He would make observations and take a look at the world and how it worked. He would draw generalizations and derive general principles. To have effective science, you really need to have a balance of both. And if you go too far on one side or the other, things get out of whack. To give an illustrative example of how this works, it's interesting to look at how the two approached politics. Plato, when he looked at politics, he started with examining abstract discussions of love and justice, taking those as his fundamental starting points, discussing the connection between the city and the souls of its citizens, and worked out his theory of politics that way, a very deductive approach from basic principles. Aristotle, on the other hand, started his analysis gathering something like 158 different constitutions and trying to analyze their effects on the states that they were where they were found. So you see as a result, Aristotle's approach tended to perhaps do a better job describing the world as it is, for better or in many cases mostly worse, where Plato and his deductive approach were able to take a look at how things could and should and ought to be instead. Now, in the context of science, famously Plato's Academy said, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." And geometry really is a classic example of a deductive approach to science. Starting with the axioms of Euclidean geometry, you work out all the consequences of plane geometry. Or you'll see things like harmonics on strings, having mathematical, deductive models of how reality works that come from first principles. Aristotle's approach to science was more organic. He would make observations. His work in biology was particularly powerful, and in fact was the standard, one of the standard references in biology well into the 18th and even 19th century. So good was Aristotle's observation and description of a lot of biological phenomena. But ultimately, Ewell, the historian, argues Aristotle asserts that knowledge depends on observation and that science is collected from facts by induction. And if we want to see who really started putting that practice into effect, we end up going back to Robert Grosseteste. Now, he was a Franciscan scholar at the University of Oxford in the 13th century. He studied Greek. He had help from a native speaker of Greek, a monk who was in Oxford helping work on translations and bringing some of these Greek manuscripts to light. Grosseteste advocated mathematics in science, especially with respect to optics and the testing of experimental theories. Now, Grosseteste proposed a two-step method for doing science. He talked about the first step being resolution and composition in order to start with both induction and deduction and form definitions or basic principles. And then the second step was verification and falsification to test those principles by observation and experiment. So very much like the more mature construction of hypotheses and testing them that we acknowledge today in science. And it's interesting to compare this to the alchemical motto, solve and coagula, to dissolve and combine. Now, the alchemists meant that literally. In a lot of the esoteric mystery cults, that was meant more figuratively or spiritually. I haven't been able to figure out exactly which came first, whether the alchemists predated Grosseteste or Grosseteste inspired the alchemists, but there's a lot of synergy there in their works. Now, Grosseteste proposed that light was the first cause and the first form of extension of matter. He appealed to the divine story of creation, arguing that creation began with a point of light that had to expand spherically outward, and in so doing generated three-dimensional space and the various spheres present in the Aristotelian cosmology. So it was actually kind of reminiscent. It's difficult. You have to be careful not to read too much into something like this. It's a bit reminiscent of Big Bang thinking on how the universe may have come into being. He used his physical models of geometry and optics in order to explain the structure. He described this cosmology and suggested that it was the laws of light that gave rise to the ordering of the universe. Of course, he did this in a largely descriptive, non-mathematical form. But it's interesting, about a decade or so ago, some scholars took his description out of De Luce and represented it in modern mathematical terms. You can take a look at that, how that theory can be expressed mathematically in the article I mentioned there from the Royal Society. Now, the influence, scholars disagree on the influence that Grosseteste had. On the one hand, you have historians of science like Alistair Cameron Crombie, who argue that Grosseteste really is the father of modern experimental science by his combination of mathematics and his empirical approach to studying things, and how Grosseteste made this methodical use of induction, deduction, and then verification. He interpreted De Luce as a serious attempt to apply mathematical reasoning to cosmology and regarded Grosseteste as laying the groundwork for all the later developments. So he points to Grosseteste as being a major innovator and inflection point in science. Well, other scholars tend to disagree, and one who did disagree famously is Alexander Koyré. And Koyré emphasized the continuity and how much Grosseteste relied on existing Neoplatonic ideas Yeah, there are a lot of things that Grosseteste said that you can find hints and traces of in earlier work. He argued that Grosseteste and his description of light was more metaphysical and less grounded in empirical science. Of course, optics was fairly primitive. Even the laws of refraction, for instance, weren't fully understood at that point. But he offered a view that Grosseteste was more an intermediate figure and not a true inflection point. But one scholar, a successor to Grosseteste, who was remarkably influential and very much ahead of his time, was Roger Bacon. I found it really fascinating how, the coincidence in names. Apparently, there's no known line of descent or relation between Roger Bacon and Francis Bacon. But Roger Bacon really anticipated a lot of what Francis Bacon would have to say, and we'll see how that played out. Bacon was educated at Oxford working with Grosseteste and also at the University of Paris. So there was a tie-in with Albertus Magnus. He returned to Oxford in 1250, but after Grosseteste died in 1253, he fell out of favor. He wasn't allowed to continue his research. Now, the politics, the religious politics that came into play here had a major impact on Bacon's career. Now, unlike the Dominicans, the Black Friars, Bacon was a Franciscan, a Grey Friar. He clashed with his superiors because of his outspoken calls for educational reform. He got prohibited from lecturing and was actually confined in Paris for his critical views. He was fortunate, though, that he came to the attention of Pope Clement IV, who gave him his big chance to explain his philosophy and his beliefs on nature. Bacon took that chance and wrote three major works over the course of 18 months, and that's how we know so much about Roger Bacon and what he did. He returned to Oxford in 1268 and did a number of pioneering lines of research, including on optics and lenses. He did work experimenting with gunpowder and other kinds of experimental science. Now, after the death of Pope Clement IV, though, Roger Bacon again fell out of favor. He was imprisoned and kept from doing research. He was finally released not long before he died in 1292 and spent his final days in Oxford. So despite that difficult career he had in adversity and where the controversy posed by his ideas caused him to be prevented from lecturing or researching, he nevertheless managed to advance Grosseteste's vision of a science based on observation and experiment. And even someone like William Whewell, who didn't have much good to say about medieval science, acknowledged that it's difficult to conceive how such a character as Roger Bacon could exist. So powerful and so far ahead of his times were his work. Now, that legacy was extended to some of the successors, the Franciscans who followed in the footsteps of Grosseteste and Roger Bacon. There was a bit of a divide in the medieval church. The Dominicans were characterized as hard workers, but very orthodox and very tied to the teachings of Aquinas and not very creative. There was more freedom in the Franciscan movement to exercise creativity, and that really came into play in England with the Franciscans. People like John Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, who pursued various kinds of empirical approaches to science. In fact, by the 1300s, kinematics had been largely worked out at Oxford, including the concept of motion under uniform acceleration. A lot of the ideas that are often credited to Galileo can trace their roots to the work of the Franciscans in Oxford. And Pierre Duhem, the French historian of science, did a lot of work showing those ties between Galilean kinematics and physics and the work that was done in the 14th century at Oxford. And those ideas spread across Europe, of course, as I mentioned, despite all of the devastation caused by the Black Death. Well, that finally brings us to Elizabethan England, absolutely fascinating era with a very rich politics, a lot of which is still very controversial. It's hard to know exactly what was going on behind the scenes. Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, his eldest son, Arthur, who was Prince of Wales, died in 1502 shortly after marrying Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish Habsburg princess. Henry VIII later married Catherine, but there was always the suspicion that Arthur may have been poisoned so as to allow the Habsburgs to secure the throne. So there was a lot of tension between the English royalty and the Habsburgs. Over time, Henry grew increasingly hostile to the Habsburgs, particularly when Charles V blocked the annulment of Henry's marriage. Of course, that, with a lot of other political machinations, led to the great break with Rome and the founding of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And that the point is, it wasn't just a matter of disagreement on abstract religious ideas, but it was driven by this dynastic and geopolitical dynamic. Edward VI ruled briefly, he died very young. Mary I ruled for a while. It was interesting. Matt shared a video yesterday from Webster Tarplay on Venetian black operations that talks a lot about some of the political machinations taking place behind the scenes, which I don't really have time to go into. But what those ended up doing is that brought to the throne Elizabeth I and sparked what's sometimes called the Elizabethan Renaissance in England. She oversaw a very transformative era for England and for science, and a cultural and scientific flourishing. She backed a lot of the early voyages of colonization and of exploration, ended up securing the independence of the British Empire through the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and her reign laid the foundations for the British Empire. Well, that context finally brings us to the figure we're here to talk about today, Francis Bacon, who I argue was more the father of scientism and not the father of science that he sometimes claimed to be. He was also known as Lord Verulam. He was a lawyer, a statesman, Lord Chancellor of England. There are any number of conspiratorial and mysterious stories associated with him. He has been alleged to be the illegitimate son of Elizabeth. There are people who argue he was involved in writing Shakespeare. He was linked to both Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism. But I'm going to focus on his influence and ties to the development of science and scientific methodology and scientism, because that's pretty straightforward. The evidence is unequivocal. The ties that he had there, and they're in the literature. You can track them down and follow up on the sources and see exactly how all of those played out. We can start with his early life and see that he had deep ties to Elizabeth and to the Elizabethan state. Ben Jonson called him a man born for the service of posterity. He was born next door to the palace. His mother was ostensibly Queen Elizabeth I's lady in waiting, and his father was Sir Nicholas Bacon, the Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. Interestingly, Bacon did not provide for ostensibly his son, Francis Bacon, his will the same way he did for his others. That's one of the pieces of evidence people appeal to, arguing that he may have been the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth. By age 12, he was admitted to Trinity College in Cambridge, disliked the curriculum. He thought it was outdated. He is reported to have read every available book in multiple languages in England and developed a critical and original mind from a young age. By the time he was 15, he dropped out due to his dissatisfaction with the academic program and learning. He entered Gray's Inn, which was the place people went to study the law for legal training. He got picked up and sent to France as a young teenager, presumably as a diplomatic observer or a spy. And at that young age, he became a master of cryptography, developing the bilateral cipher. He sent, Queen Elizabeth I sent her court painter to France to paint the portrait of young teenage Francis Bacon. You see that portrait there. And the encryption read, "If only I could paint his mind." So he made quite an impression on his contemporaries from a young age, even as a teenager. Now, if you take a look at Bacon's views on science, he outright rejected Aristotelianism. He thought that Aristotle made his natural philosophy completely subservient to logic, and that it became merely useless and disputatious. So he was really kind of reacting against the Schoolmen approach to Aristotelianism. He disdained the concept of syllogism and argued that the only hope for science is in induction. He promoted empirical observation and inductive reasoning as the foundation for science. And he argued a program he called the Great Instauration, the vision for the renewal of knowledge, science, and learning that was aimed at overcoming the stagnation of scholasticism and restoring humanity's mastery over nature through the empirical method and inductive reasoning. So for Bacon, science was a salvific affair. Science was going to save humanity from all of the threats of nature and from infirmity and old age. Science was going to be humanity's savior. Now, ironically, for all of Bacon's advocacy of science, he was notoriously short-sighted about the science that was taking place around him at the time. So, for instance, the court doctor, Dr. William Gilbert, was doing pioneering work in magnetism and electricity. And this is a etching showing Gilbert demonstrating some of his experiments in magnetism before Queen Elizabeth I. Now, the reaction that Bacon had to that was, he showed disdain for Gilbert. Despite Gilbert practicing what Bacon had preached, emphasizing the primacy of experimentation and doing this fundamental research, Bacon said that Gilbert was wasting his time probing solitary matters like looking at the magnet. So Bacon did not have any respect for Gilbert, despite the fact that Gilbert did a lot of the fundamental basics in magnetic science that we still accept and take advantage of today. Another innovator that was present contemporaneous with Bacon was the physician William Harvey. And what Harvey did was figure out how circulation worked, how the heart pumped blood and circulated it throughout the body. He was doing some really remarkable work and treating the circulatory system in hydraulic terms. That kind of as a side note, that led Thomas Hobbes to develop his theory of man as mechanism by showing that there were physical processes involved in human life with Harvey's work on circulation that was used to lend credence to Hobbes' views of man as a natural mechanism. And this work Bacon dismissed also, In addition, he was disdainful of Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo. Now, Harvey had a kind of dry comment about his powerful contemporary, arguing that Bacon writes philosophy like a Lord Chancellor. So he didn't have a lot of respect from his scientific colleagues who were actually doing genuine, groundbreaking science contemporary with him. Now, one of the other things that is often cited as some wisdom from Bacon is what are called Bacon's four idols. The idea is these idols are things that lead people astray, erroneous methods of reasoning that cause confusion and lead people into error. The first of these idols, the idols of the tribe, those are errors that arise from human nature itself, from our senses, our desires, our tendency to impose patterns on nature. So that's things like anthropomorphism, taking a look at things and assuming that they have intentions, that they're behaving like people. Apophenia and pareidolia are looking for patterns in nature and seeing patterns where you're reading those patterns into things where the patterns aren't really there. Idols of the cave, those are biases stemming from people's individual background, education, or temperament. Things like confirmation bias, you're likely to take a look at a bunch of evidence and cherry pick the things that agree with the premises you have going in. Or things like cultural blindness. If your culture is focused on a particular set of ideas, if you grow up using chopsticks, you'll look at silverware and wonder why anyone would do anything so clunky and awkward, and vice versa. If you grow up with silverware, you might question the wisdom of using chopsticks. But those are just as a result of the culture that we grow up in. The idols of the marketplace, those are misunderstandings that are caused by language and communication, where the words themselves are distorting thought and knowledge, using ambiguous or misleading descriptions, confusing the map for the territory. As an example, we talk about the genetic code. And you could talk about DNA as being a bit like a computer code in a way, with four different symbols that make up the genetic code. But if you take that analogy too far and start trying to assume that DNA is like a data storage mechanism and that biology is all just computers that are manipulating the data, you're going to be led astray by that description that you've provided. And finally, he argued about the idols of the theater leading people astray. Those are notions adopted from philosophical systems or dogmas or traditions, watching a staged illusion mistaken for the truth. The classic error of an appeal to authority that might be false, or just following blindly contemporary fashion without thinking critically about it. So, those are certainly, ways in which people can be led astray that we should guard against. But you can compare those to the work of Roger Bacon. I find it a little suspicious that Roger Bacon had his four grounds of human ignorance that aren't really cited by his successor Francis Bacon. Roger Bacon's four grounds of human ignorance were trust in inadequate authority, the force of custom leading men to accept too unquestionably what has been accepted before their time, placing confidence in the opinion of the inexperienced, and the hiding of one's own ignorance with the parade of a superficial wisdom. Now, that's a little narrower and closely defined subset of the kinds of concepts that Francis Bacon had. But you can certainly see in Roger Bacon a bit of a precursor to the thinking of Francis Bacon. And in fact, William Whewell observed that many of the expressions of the Franciscan friar, Roger Bacon, remind us of the large thoughts and lofty phrases of the philosophical chancellor, Francis Bacon. Now, any number of scholars have criticized Francis Bacon, but it's pretty clear that although it was very fashionable in standard histories of science to credit Bacon as being the founder of modern science, it's obvious he discovered nothing of importance either with it or without it. And in fact, another scholar, Morris Cohen, commented that the belief that Francis Bacon was the founder of modern science is so flagrantly in contradiction with all the facts of the history of science, and so patently belied by the contents of Bacon's work, that it's instructive to inquire how such an absurd belief ever gained currency among educated people. And I think that's really the critical point. How did that belief get such currency? Why did people regard Bacon as having this powerful and foundational role as, being equated with Newton as one of the founders of modern science? You can see that legacy even today when you look at people like Peter Thiel. And you can take a look, certainly up to 1831 or so, the majority of European thinkers regarded Bacon as on par with Newton, or at least a secondary figure, second only to Newton in his advocacy of science. You can see today transhumanists still cite Bacon as an inspiration. You can read Thiel's work, 0 to 1, where he notes Francis Bacon wrote that the prolongation of life should be considered its own branch of medicine and the noblest. So Bacon is still, being cited as an authority and as an inspiration. And the reason for that is not so much any particular work that Bacon did, either in science or in the methodology of science. The reason Bacon had such a huge legacy and outsized role is by his example and his advocacy of the power of science as being a tool to command dominion over nature. The idea of science as being a salvific project through which we will replace the superstitious religions of old and replace it with rigorous scientific dogma for rigorous scientific ideas for the betterment of mankind. You can see Ewell arguing that he presented an inspirational picture of a future philosophy that was more powerful and extensive than Aristotelianism, and advocated this new method, creating a revolution and establishing a new philosophical dynasty. And I think that's a correct statement. You can look at Frances Yates's position. Excuse me. She argued his significance led in his use in the persuasive power of Bacon's language for the advancement of knowledge. So we should go back and take a look at Bacon's philosophy and understand why it had such a power and what Bacon had to say. And you can go back to the Novum Organum, the new tool that Bacon wrote, where Bacon, it's illustrative to take a look at what he regarded as the three kinds or grades of ambition in mankind. The first or lowest grade, in Bacon's view, was those who want to extend their own power in their native country, that's vulgar and degenerate. The second was those who labor to extend the power of their country and its dominion. He argued that had more dignity, but not less covetousness. The final one, though, was a man who endeavors to establish and extend the power and dominion of the human race itself over the universe. That ambition is without doubt a more wholesome thing and more noble than the other two. So the empire of man over things is founded on arts and science alone. Nature is only to be commanded by obeying her. And that's really the crux of his philosophy, a program where science and scientific inquiry are going to make man the master of nature and provide a new school of philosophy and thought to replace the legacy schools that that came before. And this program is particularly clear when you take a look at New Atlantis. That was, I guess, what we today would call a science fiction novella. It was a short story, depending on the font size you use, about 46 pages. And unlike a lot of other writings by Bacon, it's a relatively easy read. You have to keep in mind Bacon practiced what he called the achromatic method. The idea is to write obscurely and confusingly so that your meaning is not clear unless you are being guided or educated by a master in this area who is conveying the thoughts and wisdom to you and helping you understand what the allusions and the allegories might mean in the writing. So it's basically a way of writing in public in a way that will only be understood by the acolytes who've received the inner wisdom, or by particularly insightful and clever people who can read between the lines and figure it out on their own. New Atlantis is an exception to that achromatic method because he's very clear putting those ideas into effect and showing how, in a fictional context, they might come to play in this fictional utopian kingdom that he describes in the New Atlantis. And when you read this, you can see how Bacon really was the father of scientism, in general, and was really a godfather of the technocratic world order in particular. So you can take a look. The basic concept in New Atlantis is voyagers are shipwrecked on the shores of this New Atlantis and are being acquainted with how this utopian society is being run. And they very quickly discover that, yes, this kingdom has a king, but the real power is being held by an institution of scientists that's referred to as Solomon's House. And Solomon's House has an enormous range of scientific facilities, at least the context of the day. They have large and deep caves, high towers, lakes, wells, fountains, baths, orchards, gardens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Every facility that any scientist could hope to have in order to conduct investigations into nature and practical technology. It's also interesting that Bacon describes a particularly elaborate division of labor. In Bacon's Scientific Institute, everything is divided into very narrow responsibilities, and there's a special guild that is responsible for doing those. There's one group of people who are foreign intelligence agents who sail to foreign countries to collect their wisdom and knowledge. There are those who read books, those who think up new experiments, those who perform the new experiments, those who organize the data, those who analyze the data, those who review the data and suggest new experiments, and so on. So he viewed science as being a very centrally organized, very bureaucratic, rigid structure that comes across in how Solomon's House is organized. Now, it's also interesting to see how scholars take an oath of secrecy. So, they conceal the things that they think fit to keep secret. Some of them are revealed to the kingdom at large and to the state, and some not. So it's not the king who's deciding what science gets out in his kingdom. The philosopher kings, or I guess scientist kings of Solomon's House, they're the ones calling the shot for the king and telling the king what technologies and what scientific ideas are going to be allowed out in the king's kingdom. When a scientist makes a significant discovery, they receive honor and the recognition of their peers. A statue is created to honor their invention, and they give him a liberal and honorable reward. So you can see how this is like crack cocaine for scientists and technocrats who envision themselves as being the proper people to call the shots and be in charge. And if only Bacon's view here were in action, they'd be the ones in Solomon's house really running things behind the scenes, telling the king what technologies he can use, and doing all of these scientific investigations with all the facilities and all the assistants and aides and apprentices that they could hope to have. What's interesting is, of course, that plan never came to fruition during Bacon's lifetime, but it was an inspiration for scientific humanism, and in particular for the founding of the Royal Society in Britain, for the French encyclopedists, and for the general course of secular humanistic progress throughout European culture. Now, it's fascinating to take a look at the story of the Royal Society and how it was founded. Now, the Royal Society was founded in 1660. Bacon died in, 1624, a few decades earlier. And you can go, something that just blew my mind was discovering this history of the Royal Society published in 1667. You would think it would be kind of hard to write a history of a society 7 years after its founding, but that didn't stop Thomas Pratt. And in fact, when he wrote this book, there's a frontispiece, an illustration that's opposite the title page that I show here on the slide. And this frontispiece for the history of the Royal Society shows all kinds of Masonic imagery. It's a little hard to see in the black and white here, but that is a black and white checkerboard floor, which is something of a Masonic tradition. And you can just look at the background and pick out all the different squares and compasses and the little bits and pieces of Masonic imagery. Something that's a little more subtle is the positioning of the characters. The then head of the Royal Society, Bruckner, is to the left of, Charles II is in the center, which is the position of the Grand Master. He was the royal patron, the King of England, the royal patron of the society. Bruckner, the working master, is to his left, and then Bacon is seated there to his right in the seat of the immediate past master. So it's very symbolic that Bruckner's in charge now, but the guy who in the past, who was the past master and in charge of this organization, was Francis Bacon. And in case the symbology wasn't clear in this illustration, Spratt explicitly said, I shall only mention one great man who had the true imagination of the whole extent of this enterprise as it is now set on foot, and that is the Lord Bacon. So it's very clear that in the founding of the Royal Society, that was very, very deeply influenced by Francis Bacon. It's also illustrative to note that, of course, Freemasonry did not out itself and become public until 1717. But it's very clear that Freemasonry was alive and well and intimately involved with the Royal Society back as early as its founding here in the 1660s. There's a fascinating book by Robert Lomas, Freemasonry and the Birth of Modern Science, if you want to look into that particular strand further. But unequivocally, Bacon inspired the Royal Society and is largely responsible for that program of scientism, of putting science as a means for securing human power over nature and becoming a separate and distinct school of thought. And that brings us to the question of, well, what exactly do we mean by scientism? There are a number of scholars who have looked into this. One I just discovered and started reading recently and thought had some very good insights is Eric Voegelin. His definition from 1948 paper, I have a link to down there. His definition for scientism was the assumption that the new science could create a worldview that would substitute for the religious order of the soul. And he identified it as having three principal dogmas. The assumption that mathematized science is the model to which all other sciences should conform, that all realms of being are accessible to the methods of science. If they're not, then the phenomenon is either irrelevant or illusionary. So it's a way of looking at reality through an exclusively scientific lens and trying to impose that on reality. I also really appreciated an essay that was written by the French mathematician Alexander Grothendieck. He wrote The New Universal Church in 1971. His description of scientism was that scientific knowledge is whatever can be expressed in quantitative terms or repeated under laboratory conditions, and only scientific knowledge is true or real knowledge. That scientism, of course, necessarily holds a very mechanistic or formalistic or analytic view of nature. And the logical corollary of scientism, of course, is technocracy. If science is all there is, if science is the ideal and penultimate mode of knowledge of reality, then only the scientific experts are qualified to make decisions, and the experts know best what to do, and the rest of us just need to shut up and listen to them. And of course, science and technology alone can solve mankind's problems. I got really excited when I saw that this essay had been translated by John Bell, because if you're familiar with quantum mechanics, John Bell did a lot of the pioneering work in quantum theory and in quantum entanglement. And Bell's inequality is the mathematical relationship by which we judge whether particles are entangled with each other. Unfortunately, I was soon disillusioned when I looked into it a little further, because it turns out this is a completely different John Bell. But the coincidence of the name was compelling, at least for a little bit. Well, it's interesting to trace this story of scientism from the inspiration of Bacon through Newtonian physics, which was largely regarded by a great many of his contemporaries as confirming or proving Bacon's view of science, that science was the ultimate guide to reason, that we would understand everything, not just the motions of bodies in the heavens, but the motions of people in societies and in economics, that everything could be reduced to a modified form of Newtonian physics. Now, that led from the Royal Society and Newton to the French encyclopedists, through to Auguste Comte, who coined positivism. That positivism was more or less a more abstract philosophical school until Ernst Mach, famous physicist. He wrote The Science of Mechanics, and the Mach number is named after him for some of his pioneering work in hypersonic or in supersonics. Mach introduced a kind of empirical skepticism into physics, that we should only take a look at what can be measured or observed. Those ideas influenced in turn Einstein and quantum mechanics. Ironically, Einstein, who was profoundly influenced by Mach, then recanted and saw the challenges and problems with that view, and ended up being one of the few people to argue for a causal and local version of quantum mechanics, arguing that quantum mechanics was incomplete and had to have hidden variables, famously in his EPR paper. And then of course you can trace this to the present day, where the cult of technocracy is alive and well, trying to impose these ideas grounded in scientism and that philosophy upon us all. So to summarize what I've been talking about here, I had to set the context and just talk a little bit about the medieval foundations that preceded Francis Bacon. People like Aquinas, and particularly Grosseteste and Bacon, who, Roger Bacon, who I think far more than Francis Bacon deserve the honors of being the fathers of modern experimental science. We looked a little bit at the political context in Elizabethan England. Francis Bacon, fascinating character. There's all kinds of research you can do into what he was involved in. The historically accepted facts of his life are fascinating in and of themselves. The potential that he was involved deeply behind the scenes in intelligence operations and things like Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism are a fascinating field of study. He had an enormous legacy. He certainly did not recognize good science when it was taking place right in front of him, but his advocacy of scientism, of a centralized guild of scientists running society, that's something that's definitely still with us today. And you can read that blueprint of his very clearly in his short work, The New Atlantis. So I'll conclude by telling you, if you're interested in reading more about this, the material I've discussed today, it all comes from chapter 2 of my book, Fundamentals and Origins of Electromagnetism. It's one of 3 books in my Fields and Energy trilogy, which I'm in the process of writing. You can pre-order copies of book 1. I'm working on getting it printed, so it'll be out in a couple of months. You can wait and just order it on Amazon if you prefer. Book 2 will be Where Physics Went Wrong, where I pick up the strand and I talk more about positivism and Einstein and modern physics. And then book 3 is How Electromagnetism and Quantum Mechanics Work, where I get into my ideas of physics, which I can go into in more detail if there's anyone interested as we get into questions. If you want to go and take a look, pretty much all of book 1 is already posted on my Substack. That's at etherzar.substack.com. Or you can go to fundmycomic.com, which is hosting the crowdfund if you want to just buy the whole thing in book form. I'd like to thank you all for allowing me to talk with you today, and I'd be happy to talk further about whatever questions you might have.
Yeah, that was excellent, Hans. Better than I imagined. Thank you so much for going through this wonderful composition, the hardcore quotes and citations. I really appreciate good old-fashioned great like just quotes to just really anchor a point down firmly into the mind, and you did that wonderfully. So the thing that struck me too is just the irony that though Bacon is always extolling the importance of, expanding humanity and speaking of humanity in a general way and our influence over nature. Sounds all well and good, but then when you actually get in, you read between the lines, as you pointed out, which the astute mind should always be doing, is looking for the intention between the words. You start discovering that his idea of humanity is one where most human beings have to live in some form of controlled ignorance for a high priesthood. So he always has this technocratic elite lording over the masses of slaves, intellectually speaking and physically, at the end of the day. So it's such a hypocrisy. But yeah, that really struck out. Um, Gerald has a couple of questions. Go for it, Gerald.
Sure.
Oh, thanks. Oh, thanks, Matt. And thanks, Hans. That was very, very interesting. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'll limit it to 2 to give other people a chance.
Well, you're welcome to reach out offline later, and I'll be happy to talk to you about your extra questions.
Okay. My first question is the name of your organization, Society for Post-Quantum Research, and the SPQR. Now, I took Latin in high school, so when I saw SPQR, it kind of rang a bell because I guess that's it. It's the Roman Republic as opposed to the Roman Empire, SPQR. I just wanted to know, did you have that in mind when you kind of picked SPQR?
Oh, I absolutely had that in mind. Thematically, I am presenting a classical approach to physics, and I'm looking at, I'm trying to restore and strengthen physics by returning it to its classical roots. And what is more classical than classical Rome? So I kind of leaned into that symbology. There are a couple. I know we can go into detail on some of the subtle things that are in the logo that I have. Behind the traditional Roman eagle, which looks like more like a hybrid of a phoenix rising from the ashes, there's a logo of what's called a Smith chart, and some of my scientific work has involved studying how radiation works and how electromagnetic energy transitions from being bound to antennas to decoupling and radiating away. And if you study that process on an impedance chart that microwave or electrical RF engineers use, that's called a Smith chart, you get this kind of yin-yang symbol. So I have that embedded in there, and I've used that as kind of a personal sigil, trying to steal the yin yang back from Bohr in his attempt to use that for complementarity. So and the arrows that are grasped by the eagle, if you take a look, they are kind of bent and crooked in exactly the same way particle trajectories are in pilot waves. So I kind of went crazy and just threw a whole bunch of symbology, stealing and making these symbols my own from the people who would misuse things like phoenixes and yin yangs and so forth for nefarious purposes.
Very good, very good. Because I can see your affinity for the Roman Republic as opposed to Francis Bacon, who would seem more comfortable in the Roman Empire. But my other question is, when you were talking about scientism, interesting, and you mentioned they view mathematized science as the real science, and it reminded me of the stuff they indoctrinate people with today, game theory and cybernetics. And it just seems all connected to that, which also goes into technocracy. But I wondered if you would comment on that, its connection to game theory and cybernetics.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it all boils back to if you can't write an equation, you don't have real knowledge. So if you can't write an equation that describes the behavior of people using game theory, or that describes economics and cash flows, if you can't write an equation, you don't have real knowledge of what's going on. And that idea is pervasive in a lot of scientific history. I mean, people were always more comfortable with Euclidean geometry, for instance, as being the archetype of true mathematical knowledge, because you got your axioms, and once you take your axioms for granted, well, everything follows out deductively and unequivocally from there. In fact, Newton's approach to physics, Newton's a fascinating character because he did so many things right, and they're mixed in with so many things that are really highly questionable. But one of the things that he did right in developing his physics is he placed great reliance on empirical data. He was relying on the observations of Kepler and Tycho Brahe to work out the laws of the motions of planets. He got notoriously into a big feud with Flamsteed, and again, I have to acknowledge my debt to Matt, who shared some of the I forget what the book that what was the title of the book on Newton's rivals and Flamsteed and Gray?
Newton's Tyranny.
Newton's Tyranny. That was a great book. I hadn't been aware. I knew there was tension there. I hadn't been aware of all the skullduggery that Newton was engaged in behind the scenes there. But he was using Flamsteed's data to try to correct and calculate his calculations of for the three-body problem for the motion of the moon, which is a very tricky problem. But Newton's work was heavily inductive, heavily empirical. He was relying on a lot of data. He was looking at observations of comets and calculating cometary orbits and things like that. And that's how he came up with and validated his universal law of gravitation and his laws of mechanics. Now, fast forward about 50, 60 years, and you had a mostly French continental school of physicists who mathematized Newton. And a lot of their work, I mean, very valid work. It's accurate and correct, but the mindset was fascinating. You had people like Maupertuis coming up with the principle of least action. You had L'Hopital, who basically said, "Oh, Newton's laws; those are intuitively obvious axioms, just like Euclid's axioms, and we can deduce things like the principle of least action and other mathematical systems for understanding how kinematics work." And finally, you get I always mix up Laplace and Lagrange. It's Lagrange who, in his work on mechanics, famously said, "You're not going to find any figures or geometry in my book. Everything is all equations." So it was a case where the empirical inductive foundation laid by Newton got turned into this deductive mathematized system by his successors. And that's really the school of thought. I mean, that's the whole shut up and calculate school of thought that really dominates a lot of contemporary physics. We've got equations to describe what goes on. It's a waste of time to engage in idle metaphysical speculation about what might really be happening. Do the experiment, look at the data, compare to the mathematical equation, shut up and calculate. That's what science is all about. And that attitude is really pervasive in physics today.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's some requests for you to do a follow-up lecture on post-quantum science, which I highly endorse. And yeah, I'm gonna put my name on that petition as well. The I guess not to open up too open of a question, but in a brief fashion, or as brief as you want to make it, frankly, there's no time limit here, so it could be whatever it could be. It could be a teaser. What would you say were the most important things that people have to understand about what went wrong with science in the early 20th century? Because you and I have been chatting about the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller interests influencing the Carnegies, influencing the derailment of the natural creative growth that was, people were expecting there's going to be many more paradigm shifting, great breakthroughs coming out of Max Planck's work and Curie and everything else. Could you say something about the derailment of it?
Oh, sure. I alluded a little bit to that, talking about Mach and positivism.
Mm-hmm.
Einstein was the vector that really introduced positivism into modern physics. It's fascinating when you go back and you read the source material about relativity, because people like Heaviside and Fitzgerald and Lorentz had worked out most of what we would refer to as special relativity, the electrodynamics of moving bodies. They had worked it all out, and Lorentz had his Lorentz transforms, and Poincaré had the foresight to argue that these discoveries of the electrodynamics of moving bodies were going to require us to adopt a new kind of mechanics that he called relativity, and that would entail a mechanics where the speed of light is a maximum velocity. I mean, a lot of relativity had already been laid out in broad strokes, grounded in the electromagnetic science of people that followed from Maxwell and his successors. And Einstein, who had read both Mach and Poincaré, came up with his approach to special relativity, where he showed that if we start with two fundamental principles, that the speed of light is the same for all observers, and the second principle, that the laws of physics are the same for all observers and all initial reference frames. He showed from those two principles he could deduce all of the complicated rules that Lorentz and others had come up with for the motion of moving electromagnetic bodies. And it was a remarkable discovery. It was very creative. But what that did was kind of encourage people to decouple the science of relativity from its empirical foundations in things like the Michelson-Morley experiment. In fact, Einstein really didn't rely on the Michelson-Morley experiment was an experiment where an attempt was made to measure velocity through the ether by looking at the speed of light as it moved in different directions through an interferometer, and established that there wasn't a shift in the velocity nearly as big as people were expecting based on the calculations they did. That was one of the inspirations behind the development of relativity. But what Einstein did was he took that Machian observer first. What does the observer see? Let's focus on the observations. Now, when Mach was arguing for his view of physics, he argued it's the observations that are fundamental. We don't ask ourselves what's really going on. We ask ourselves, what do we see and what do we measure and what do we perceive? So Mach, for instance, never accepted the existence of atoms. He thought atoms were a convenient fiction by which we organize the bundles of sense perceptions that we acquire when we are doing chemical experiments, for instance. Well, that was the view that Einstein introduced into physics. And of course, if you're focused on the observables, if you're focused on, well, the observer sees the speed of light as constant, the observer sees that the laws of physics are the same in all inertial frames, you don't have to appeal to anything like an ether or any sort of mechanism or any sort of process. It becomes completely irrelevant. You just focus on the observations and ignore everything else. And that was what Einstein and a lot of his successors did. Now, fast forward about 10 years to 1915, and Einstein came up with the extended relativity to accelerating bodies. He developed what was called the theory of general relativity, which governs gravitation and how it works. One of the best discussions of general relativity, just explaining what it's all about, was due to a guy named John Wheeler. And Wheeler said that general relativity can be summed up by saying that matter and energy tell space how to curve. And then space, through its curvature, tells matter and energy how to move. So there's that relationship between matter and energy in a location and how it distorts the geometry of space, and then how that distorted curvature geometry of space governs the motion of light and particles in space. Well, as Einstein came up with that, of course, all of a sudden that's appealing to a very ether-like concept. It's appealing to the idea that empty space somehow has this property of curvature associated with it, that at any given point in space, it's curving one way or another. In fact, Einstein gave a lecture in 1920 at Leiden, at the university there, where Lorentz was on the faculty. Of course, Lorentz was a long-term ether proponent, and it may have been because Einstein wanted to be generous toward his host, but he probably was coming around to this perspective that general relativity involved an ether-like curvature of space. In fact, he explicitly said that the geometric curvature of space was very much like an ether of space. So Einstein was backing away from that hardcore fundamentalist observer-only perspective as early as 1920 or so. Well, move forward another 5 years, and Heisenberg is presenting his work on quantum mechanics in a lecture in Berlin. And Einstein invited Heisenberg back to his apartment for a discussion after the lecture. We only became aware of this because Heisenberg wrote a memoir, Physics and Beyond, in 1970. And of course, we only have Heisenberg's word for it, so take that for what it's worth. But what Heisenberg described is Einstein questioned him, where are the electron trajectories in this quantum mechanics of yours? Where are the electrons hiding in your mathematical calculations? And Heisenberg said, aha, we have no need for electron trajectories. That's not what we're observing. We're just focusing on what we observe before and after this quantum process has taken place, and we don't have to bother ourselves with what's really going on in between. And Einstein was very skeptical of that approach. So Heisenberg proceeded to quote Einstein back to Einstein about the importance of focusing on the observables and all the other philosophic foundations that Einstein had been advocating about special relativity. And Einstein was a bit taken aback. And according to Heisenberg, he looked back and he said, well, I may have written that at one time and may have said all these things, but it's nonsense just the same. He rejected that whole only look at the observables, and it's metaphysically meaningless to talk about what's going on in between. Einstein basically reversed course, and he rejected that premise that special relativity was based on. But by then it was really too late. That train had left the station, and Heisenberg and Bohr and everyone else were on board with this, we're focusing on the observables approach to quantum mechanics. And even people who were objecting to it, like Schrodinger said, the whole concept of Schrodinger's cat has been taken as, oh yeah, that's the way reality works. You put the cat in the box, you have the 50% chance of the radioactive decay triggering the mechanism to open the vial of poison, and the cat is simultaneously alive and dead until the observer opens the box to see what happens. Schrodinger came up with that as a reductio ad absurdum to show how ridiculous the whole observer-centric approach to quantum mechanics was. And people take that literally and will literally argue that Schrodinger's cat is exactly how reality works. I mean, it's the old, if no one hears the tree fall in the forest, it doesn't make a sound. It has to be observed for it to be real or worthy of notice. Einstein ultimately wrote his arguments down in a paper with Podolsky and Rosen. It's called the EPR paper, after the initials of the investigators, where he advocated that quantum mechanics was incomplete and that it required hidden variables. And that paper to this day is now I think the single most cited paper Einstein wrote. And in large respect, if you look at Einstein from the perspective of a century or more later, that's probably going to end up being the most significant thing he did, arguing that quantum mechanics was on the wrong path and that it needed to reject that observer-only approach. Now, circling back to what Matt was talking about is, how did these ideas achieve such dominance in physics? And as I was going through the history of modern physics and the histories of all of these physicists, I kept running into, and then he got a fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation to go study with Bohr in Copenhagen. And you see that once, you kind of brush over it. But when it's in biography after biography after biography after biography of all of these famous American scientists who shaped modern physics, I started digging in further and pulled out the history of the Rockefeller Foundation. And what I discovered is that Bohr's Copenhagen Institute, one of the largest supporters and funders was the Rockefeller Institute. Now, why they did it? Well, you can read the history. Of course, they were just looking for the best and brightest in physics, and they wanted to put their money where it would do the most good advancing physics. And they had purely noble means and noble motives, and there was no other agenda behind just wanting to make sure that they selflessly advanced the cause of science by giving the best people the money so that they could do their investigations without having to worry about the finances. I haven't found anything that directly contradicts that narrative, but you can take a look at the video that Matt posted about their funding of history as opposed to their funding of science. and how when the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation were funding the study of history, it was all so as to shape the historical narrative in a way that suited their purpose. So seeing that, I have to wonder if there weren't similar motivations behind the way that the Rockefeller Foundation funded the course and the development of modern physics up through World War II. And Matt was just telling me offline about how after World War II, the government started funding history, and the foundations could stop and use their resources elsewhere. Of course, the exact same thing happened in science. The National Science Foundation in the U.S. was founded a few years after the end of World War II and picked up the mantle of funding the course of science, with the result being that science today is a highly centralized affair where there are limited sources of funding, where if you want to do science, you have to pass peer review. And it's really difficult to do anything controversial or genuinely creative or novel because it's going to ruffle too many feathers. So that kind of work doesn't get the support it needs to move forward. So that, in kind of a long way, is my answer to that question. Let me dispatch my green screen while I'm listening to the next question.
No, that's a great answer, and I'm gonna try to clip that out as like a little self-contained teaser. That's how I'm gonna market it, as a teaser for your upcoming class that we're gonna do down the line on what would be a healthier quantum mechanics and what went wrong. And Cynthia, back in the day, she her first degree was from the University of Alberta, and it was in molecular genetics. And she shifted her career course because her plan was to like somehow go into this field, figure out how to be creative. And then towards the end, she told me how she, when talking to a few of her, or one of her professors, was shocked to hear that this professor, the most proud moment of their life was having published, after like 7 years of research, a peer-reviewed paper in some relatively, I guess, respected journal for that niche. It's just so compartmentalized, the way Bacon was laying it out, but it's so compartmentalized, where she was like marking out some genetic marker of a subset of molecules within cellular biology, and just she was just looking with no context at this one little thing in lab work, with no purpose beyond just to like get another detail for how this thing interacts with other cells. And finally, it was her point of pride that after years this was published, and it became more and more clear that the type of job options for somebody coming out of that field was going to be hyper myopically shackled to something with no higher purpose, divided from other fields of physics, of biology, of everything. It's just, so she basically shifted gears and went on a different path in life. But you see it so much, right? This compartmentalized, broken down, divided system where getting everybody to individually just divide their minds into little fields of specialization really destroys the mind's ability to understand anything beyond what their senses show them or what authorities tell them must be true. It's right. Yeah. Everyone should be reading Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. I didn't realize
it's a very easy read. Yeah, I speak as a science fiction author as well. I've read better stories, I have to admit, but at least it is far clearer, and it's one of the few things Francis Bacon wrote without trying to be deliberately obscure. So, if you want an easy introduction to what Francis Bacon thought, you can see how Francis Bacon thought it would work out in practice right there in the New Atlantis. You can get through it in maybe an hour, one sitting. It's a very easy read.
What did you call that technique of opaque writing?
Bacon called it the achromatic method. I haven't seen that word used outside the context of Francis Bacon. It's not a very popular word. Its meaning is hidden apparently by those who practice it. But yeah, the basic idea is that as you are writing your esoteric or occult ideas, you end up having them, you write obscurely so that you cannot easily be understood, except by very intelligent people who can see past your obscuration, or by people who are being guided by a tutor or as an initiate into your school of thought.
Yeah, right.
I see Sue has her hand up.
Yeah, we got a couple now of we have Sue, we'll have Jerry, we got Ginger, and we got Adam. So let's do those, and then so Sue, go for it.
Thank you. I think I'm still on share, Matt, from I don't know.
Don't worry about it. All's good.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hans. You brought up Eric Voegelin, and I've just recently started listening to some writers, scholars who are doing a further thesis based on his work. And he talked about immanentization and Gnosticism weaving into scientism. What I'm finding with these new thinkers, they're bringing in the Kabbalah as well. And you don't have to make a comment on that. But what I'm concerned about is that they don't seem to make a distinction between technocracy and technological development. And I'm wondering if Voegelin did. I haven't read his work directly, so I guess I could. And then I was just hearing that Francis Bacon actually gave a speech to the English Parliament about the new Atlantis. So even though it was published posthumously, he actually spoke about that. And then these same authors are making connections to the Puritans, were very influenced by the whole new Jerusalem, creating a new Jerusalem in the New World, and just whatever you want to share about.
On Voegelin, I just discovered Voegelin like 2 weeks ago, so I cannot consider myself a very astute Voegelin scholar. I read his paper on the origins of scientism. It's a pretty dense paper. I liked what he had to say about scientism. He had a long discussion on, he wasn't really focused on Francis Bacon. He kind of started out talking about Giordano Bruno, and then he focused a lot on the arguments between Newton, an associate of Newton, Clarke, and Leibniz. About this, that focused on that whole issue of scientism and Newton's idea of absolute space, as opposed to Leibniz's approach and Leibniz's criticism of Newton. It's an interesting discussion. I haven't really fully digested it yet, but it was clear to me there's a lot of interesting stuff in what Voegelin had to say. So I certainly endorse he's worth reading to see what you can learn from him. I was not aware that Bacon had given a speech to Parliament on the New Atlantis, and now my first job after I get off here, I'm going to have to hunt that down for myself and see what I can find out about what he had to say. On the subject of colonization, it's amazing what Bacon had his hands involved in. On my slide, I shared, and I forgot to highlight that stamp from Newfoundland that was crediting Bacon as being one of the moving spirit behind the colonization of Newfoundland. He was also involved in the Virginia Company and the colonization of America. So, clearly the broader program for advancing the interests of the British Empire, of which Bacon was a key mover at the start, also involved those colonization efforts of Canada and of what became the United States. So he was involved in a lot of the early planning and execution of the British imperial project.
Right, including with some of the Puritans then?
I'm not sure of a specific tie to the Puritans. He may well have been. That was toward the end of his life. I know he was involved in the Virginia Company and in Newfoundland. I don't know if he was specifically involved in the Massachusetts Bay Colony at all. But he may well have been. He had his fingers in a lot of stuff.
Right. Thank you. Very, very interesting. Thanks.
I'll say one thing on that point because I can't help myself. The first controversy in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you guys know what it was called? Is the antinomianist controversy, where the first governor, who was this aristocratic Dutch guy before John Winthrop took over, was patronizing. He was bringing in all of these nominally Puritans, but they were all antinomianists who were under Annie Hutchinson's leadership as this sort of high priestess figure who was basically promoting a new Manichaeanism that promoted the idea that your soul is fine no matter what lusts you basically give into. Like, so the laws of the body have no connection to the laws of the soul, and you can thus do what you want to kind of want to do, hedonistically speaking. And of course, she didn't come out so like literally on that, but that was the effect, and that was a huge battle because she was being sponsored by some high level people within the Dutch Venetian operation. And then this guy, I think Henry Vale or whatever, the governor, when he's finally overthrown, like Annie Hutchinson's kicked out, and her whole sect goes and founds Rhode Island, which becomes the center of this global like Caribbean slave empire with Africa under the, so you got that going on. And then this guy goes and advises, he tries to sneak in to become an advisor of Oliver Cromwell. And yeah, gets his head cut off by Charles II. But you've got like these nasty characters that Jerry has been investigating too. But I just want to share that because I don't know of a direct connection between what you're talking about with Bacon and Sarpi and company, but there probably is. It's probably not a coincidence that shit's going on in the colonies while you have Bacon's tentacles as well, trying to shape things that way. Something to look into. On that note, since Jerry has been also looking at this stuff, and I know Jerry, you got a question on Roger Bacon. Did you want anything you want to add to either what's been said or pose your question on Roger Bacon?
No, I won't add anything. It's just the colonization was a mixed bag. There were people who really wanted colonization and those who wanted the colonies to be an appendage of the British East India Company. So I think you explained it quite well there, Matt. But I know, Hans, you talked about Francis Bacon, but I wanted to ask you a question about Roger Bacon because I like Roger Bacon and I like his approach to science. And I want to thank you for bringing up Robert Grosseteste because I'm not familiar with him at all. So, and I really liked him, the way he was discussed. And just from my own reading, I know that, well, Roger Bacon has a connection to, I guess we could call it Islamic writers, Arabic writers, as that knowledge was brought into Europe, I guess through the Moors. And I was just wondering if you had done any work on that, on the Arabic influence on people like Roger Bacon and Robert Grosseteste, because I really like the way those two people thought. Anyway, I'd like your thoughts on that.
I haven't done anything, I haven't gone into any great depth on that. I was interested, though, to learn that there was a Byzantine, Greek Orthodox, I think, monk who was working with Robert Grosseteste to help him translate some of the Greek texts that he was studying and working on. So I would assume there would have been some overlap with Grosseteste's young associate, Roger Bacon. There was certainly a lot of work done. I think Aristotle really came into the awareness of Western Europe through Moorish Spain. Was Averroes was a key figure there. I haven't really gone into the details of exactly what knowledge was transmitted by whom, but clearly there were very strong connections between the Islamic world through the Moorish Spain and increasingly the Byzantine and Greek knowledge that was probably coming through Venice and other trade channels with the East at the time.
Mm. Yeah, I would be curious if the Paleologs, who are the Platonic faction within the Orthodox Church, were involved perhaps in being the conduit of some of the healthier philosophies that the Arabs had discovered back into the Western Europe. Uh, Interesting question. Okay, thank you. Um, so we got Ginger had a short little question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Hans. I loved your presentation, and I'm really interested in your books. I think I might have to purchase them all. I'm I'm a homeschooler, and I was wondering where you think your books fall into an ideal curriculum for high school age kids. So when it comes to teaching kids, what ages of kids you think could be introduced to your work in your books? Do you consider them college level or maybe advanced high school level? Thank you.
I would consider them advanced high school level. I tell this story on the crowdfund page because it was really the inspiration behind my work. Yeah, I came up with my ideas on electromagnetism and how it worked. Oh goodness, well over 10 years ago, and had a very frustrating time getting anyone to listen, anyone to take me seriously. After 6 long years of effort, I finally got a peer-reviewed article published in a pretty prestigious journal. But the amount of effort that I had to go through, the hoops I had to jump through, it was not worth doing. And I was talking with some friends of mine, the science fiction grandmaster John C. Wright, who I have a lot of respect for, and his wife, El Jaji Lamplighter, who's also a very good fantasy and fiction writer. I was having dinner with them and kind of talking about how things were going and how frustrated I was getting my ideas out there. And they said, "Well, what are these ideas?" And so I explained to them how, my idea of electromagnetism and how it works. Took me like 10, 15 minutes to get through the whole thing. And they got it. And oh, that makes perfect sense. And that was when the light bulb turned on for me that it's not that the ideas I had were so complicated that scientists just couldn't understand them. It was that they were so different from the conventional thinking that it's very difficult for someone who is well trained and has a very mature view of physics and electromagnetism to be able to set that aside and consider an approach that's different in its fundamentals. So I've tried to write my books on fields and energy on the level where a curious student or an interested layperson who maybe has only a very basic familiarity with physics would be able to read them and understand what I have to say. So I think they're pretty dense, but I think they are within reach for an advanced high school student.
Cool. Yeah, and for those who may not realize it, go to the description box under this video and you can pre-order all of those books and also subscribe and support Hans with the GoFundMe. Um, Adam Sedia has been listening in, has a question. Adam, you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah.
Before I go to my question, I might be able to shed some light on the question Jerry had real quick. In 1231, the Spaniards captured Cordoba, and the library there under Alfonso the Wise was circulated through Europe, particularly Paris, which I think you said Grosseteste was in Paris. So he would have been exposed to those texts right when they went into the public, so to speak, if that answers and helps at all. But my question is, I'm interested in your take on science versus scientism. And it's the more I read and the more I know, it's my theory that the people who embrace scientism aren't the ones actually doing the science. And the ones who do the science have a very different take from scientism. And I think that was the case with Francis Bacon. And I was wondering if you could go into that and your ideas on that a little more. And it was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. It was very in-depth and enlightening.
Oh, well, thank you for those kind words. I think you're exactly right that is a common pattern. We certainly saw that in Francis Bacon with his, he was the advocate, the cheerleader for science. He'd be the kind of guy who would be, in a modern context, he'd be a great director of DARPA or director of the National Science Foundation. As a leader and inspiration to all of the other scientists, but kind of keeping them in line and on the right, the accepted path. You see today a lot of the people who are, the public would regard as the most prominent scientists, like Neil deGrasse Tyson comes to mind, where he's someone who is more of a science communicator, who is talking about the modern philosophy of science. So actually, it was interesting. Tyson is very disdainful of philosophy of science. Real physicists, they don't need no philosophy, and they're not going to waste their time with those idle philosophical speculations. Is his perspective. So he and other people are publicly promoting those ideas of scientism, of science, as a overarching universal intellectual paradigm through which we have to view everything in the world. And I think that you're right to the extent scientists are more connected with doing the science, with taking the data and analyzing it. I think they're less caught up in those philosophical flights of fancy that we see taking place.
Thank you.
All right, we're rounding out the top of the hour. I'm going to give people a chance to pose, or the top of the second hour, sorry. I'm going to give people a chance to think through, dig into your brains. You have one last chance to pose a question if it's burning. Now to Hans. All right. And Marty just jumped in saying apologies, but he's looking forward to catching the whole one when it's posted. Marty, yeah, you're going to love this one, Marty. It'll blow your mind. Hans, thank you so much for going through this. And again, like I said, all of your links are in the description box. We're going to talk about when would be the best time to do a follow-up one on the more cutting-edge, modern, healthier sciences that you've been helping to bring to the surface. I'm very curious. And yeah, thank you, everybody, for sharing this Sunday with us. All right, until the next one. Bye-bye.